At its height, ancient Egypt did not merely appear powerful, it appeared permanent. Its kings commanded armies across the eastern Mediterranean, controlled gold-rich territories deep in Nubia, filled enormous temples with wealth, and carved their victories into stone as if history itself had been conquered. Long before Rome became an empire, Egypt had already survived invasions, civil wars, religious revolutions, and the collapse of entire dynasties. Yet the civilization's greatest advantage was also its deepest vulnerability. Almost everything depended on keeping one narrow river valley politically united, economically productive, and spiritually convinced that the ruler could preserve order. Ancient Egypt did not rise once and then fall once. It repeatedly built a powerful centralized state, watched that state fragment, and then reconstructed it under a new dynasty. The pyramids belonged to one Egyptian age. The empire of Tutankhamun and Ramesses II belonged to another. Cleopatra lived closer in time to the modern world than to the construction of the Great Pyramid. What disappeared in 30 BC was therefore not a single unchanging kingdom, but the final independent version of a political system that had been adapting for roughly 3,000 years. The familiar image of Egypt begins with monuments. Pyramids rising from the desert, colossal statues guarding temples, tombs prepared for eternity. But the true foundation of Egyptian power was not stone, it was administration. Almost every year, the Nile overflowed its banks, spreading water and fertile sediment across the surrounding fields. When the flood was favorable, the land could produce large grain surpluses. Those surpluses supported people who were not farmers: scribes, priests, soldiers, miners, architects, craftsmen, officials, and royal workers. The state measured fields, assessed crops, collected taxes largely in goods and labor, stored grain, organized irrigation, and redistributed resources. The river also functioned as Egypt's central transport system. Heavy stone, grain, soldiers, livestock, and government messages could travel along a natural route connecting the Mediterranean coast with the interior of Africa. The current carried vessels north, while prevailing winds helped sails move south. Geography had given Egypt something rare in the ancient world: a long country that could be connected more easily than many smaller kingdoms. But geography alone did not create Egypt. Political power had to convert the river valley into one system. Around 3100 BC, rulers associated with southern Egypt brought Upper and Lower Egypt under a single monarchy. The pharaoh became more than a military leader. He was presented as the guardian of Ma'at, the principle of order, balance, justice, and cosmic stability. His authority connected government with religion. Taxes were not simply extracted by a palace. They supported a sacred order that was believed to keep chaos beyond Egypt's borders. That belief gave the state extraordinary organizing power. A local ruler might command loyalty from a town or region. The pharaoh claimed responsibility for the harmony of the entire land, the success of the harvest, the protection of temples, and the proper relationship between humanity and the gods. During the Old Kingdom, beginning around the 27th century BC, this system reached its first monumental peak. Kings such as Djoser, Sneferu, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure mobilized enormous quantities of stone, food, labor, transport, and technical expertise. The Great Pyramid of Khufu was not simply a tomb. It was evidence that the monarchy could coordinate resources on a national scale. The people who built the pyramids were not merely anonymous masses dragged into the desert. Archaeological evidence points to organized labor forces that included permanent specialists and rotating workers supported with food, housing, tools, and medical care. Pyramid construction drew farmers into state projects during parts of the agricultural cycle when their fields demanded less labor. The monument was therefore also an economic machine, turning agricultural surplus into royal legitimacy. This was the central contradiction of Egyptian power. The state demonstrated its strength by moving resources toward the king, his tomb, and the institutions surrounding his divine office. But the more wealth the monarchy transferred to temples, funerary foundations, officials, and regional administrators, the more difficult it became to keep that wealth under direct royal control. Over generations, powerful families gained influence in the provinces. Offices could remain within families. Temple estates accumulated land and privileges. Royal resources were divided among institutions created to preserve the memory and cults of earlier kings. The monarchy still looked eternal in stone, but the system behind the monuments was becoming less concentrated. Environmental stress intensified the danger. Toward the end of the Old Kingdom, episodes of weak Nile flooding appear to have reduced agricultural production. The precise relationship between climate and political collapse remains debated, but poor harvests would have placed severe pressure on any government dependent on grain taxation and redistribution. When the center could no longer guarantee abundance and stability, regional leaders became more important. By roughly the 22nd century BC, the Old Kingdom had fractured. Egypt entered the first intermediate period, during which rival centers competed for authority. The pyramids remained. The royal ideology survived. What had weakened was the government's ability to turn those ideas into control over the entire valley. This was not the end of Egyptian civilization. It was the first demonstration of how Egypt failed. When the central government lost command of agricultural surplus, provincial loyalty, and religious legitimacy at the same time, the kingdom fragmented. Yet the same geography that had supported unification made reunification possible. A ruler who controlled enough of the Nile could extend power along the river and rebuild the administrative network. That is what Mentuhotep II of Thebes achieved around the beginning of the 2nd millennium BC. His victory over northern rivals established the Middle Kingdom, a period remembered for renewed stability, literature, irrigation projects, trade, and stronger royal administration. Later Middle Kingdom rulers tried to prevent the provincial independence that had weakened the Old Kingdom. The monarchy expanded bureaucratic control, developed the Fayum region, strengthened southern frontiers, and constructed forts in Nubia. Egypt was becoming more security conscious. It did not simply celebrate unity, it built systems designed to defend it. Yet the rebuilt state again depended heavily on the authority of the royal house. When central leadership weakened during the later Middle Kingdom, rival dynasties emerged. At the same time, communities from Western Asia had been settling in the Nile Delta through migration, trade, and employment. Eventually, rulers known as the Hyksos established power over much of northern Egypt. Later Egyptian tradition portrayed the Hyksos as foreign occupiers, but their rise was not simply the result of one sudden invasion. They benefited from political division inside Egypt. They used technologies already spreading through the region, including horse-drawn chariots and advanced forms of weaponry. From their capital at Avaris, they ruled the north while Egyptian dynasties survived farther south. For the rulers of Thebes, divided sovereignty was unacceptable. A sequence of southern kings fought northward until Ahmose I captured Avaris around the mid-16th century BC. The Hyksos were expelled, Egypt was reunited, and the experience transformed Egyptian strategy. Earlier kings had often relied on deserts, fortifications, and controlled borders to protect the Nile Valley. The founders of the new kingdom concluded that waiting for threats to reach Egypt was too dangerous. Security would now be pursued beyond Egypt's traditional frontiers. The result was the most powerful Egyptian state the ancient world had yet seen. New Kingdom armies campaigned into Nubia and Western Asia. Pharaohs including Thutmose I and Thutmose III expanded Egyptian authority through warfare, tribute, garrisons, diplomacy, and alliances. Nubia provided access to gold, labor, cattle, and trade routes reaching farther into Africa. Territories and client rulers in the Levant connected Egypt to the wealth and politics of the eastern Mediterranean. Foreign tribute and domestic taxation flowed into royal and temple institutions. Karnak grew into a vast religious complex. Monumental building reached a scale not seen since the Pyramid Age. Egypt exchanged gifts and royal marriages with other major powers, including Babylon, Mitanni, and the Hittite Empire. Its court sat at the center of an international system. This was Egypt's moment of maximum power. It was wealthy enough to project force abroad, build enormous monuments at home, reward temples, and maintain a professional class of administrators and craftsmen. But empire changed the structure of the kingdom. Egypt now had expensive frontiers to defend, foreign relationships to manage, military elites to reward, and increasingly wealthy religious institutions to support. The priesthood of Amun became especially influential. Successful pharaohs donated land, labor, livestock, treasure, and captured wealth to the temples. These gifts advertised devotion and strengthened the religious foundation of kingship. They also created institutions with their own estates, workers, administrators, and economic power. The crown and the temples were not always enemies. They usually depended on one another, but every grant placed resources beyond the simplest form of direct royal control. Once again, the machinery that strengthened the monarchy was quietly creating alternative centers of power. The danger became visible during the 14th century BC, when Amenhotep IV attempted one of the most radical transformations in Egyptian history. Renaming himself Akhenaten, he elevated the Aten, represented by the sun disk, and built a new capital at Amarna. Traditional temples, especially those associated with Amun, lost royal favor. Akhenaten may have been motivated by genuine religious conviction, political calculation, or both. Whatever his intentions, the revolution disrupted the relationship between the monarchy, the priesthoods, and established religious practice. After his death, the court abandoned Amarna, restored the traditional gods, and attempted to erase much of his legacy. Tutankhamun, famous today because of his largely intact tomb, was politically important less for personal achievement than for restoration. Under his reign, the old religious order returned. Later rulers worked to present the Amarna period as an interruption. Egypt had survived the experiment. but it had revealed how dangerous institutional conflict could become when royal ideology moved too far from established systems of authority. The 19th dynasty restored military confidence. Seti I campaigned in the Levant, and Ramesses II fought the Hittites at Kadesh before eventually reaching a peace agreement with them. Ramesses filled Egypt with monuments carrying his name and ruled for more than 6 decades. To later generations, he appeared to embody timeless kingship. But long reigns create their own risks. Heirs died before reaching the throne. Court networks aged. Succession became more complicated. The monuments projected continuity, yet Egypt's position abroad was already under pressure. Around 1200 BC, the interconnected political order of the Eastern Mediterranean entered a severe crisis. The Hittite Empire disappeared, cities were destroyed or abandoned, trade networks weakened. Population movements, warfare, internal rebellion, food shortages, and environmental pressures appear to have combined in different ways across the region. Under Ramesses III, Egypt fought major attacks by groups Egyptian records collectively portrayed as northern invaders, often called the Sea Peoples. His victory scenes at Medinet Habu present the pharaoh as a triumphant defender of civilization. Egypt did survive while other states collapsed. But survival was expensive. Military campaigns consumed resources without recreating the stable imperial system of earlier centuries. Egypt's influence in the Levant contracted. External tribute declined. Domestic institutions still demanded support, and temples continued to receive immense royal donations. The government could celebrate victory while the economic foundations of empire were narrowing. The contradiction became unmistakable at Deir el-Medina, the community of skilled workers responsible for royal tombs. During the reign of Ramesses III, delayed grain rations led workers to stop working and protest. It is among history's earliest documented labor strikes. The state capable of decorating a king's path into eternity was struggling to feed the people building it. The problem was not that Egypt suddenly became poor. It was that resources were being absorbed by a system that had grown expensive, fragmented, and difficult to command. Temple estates controlled substantial wealth. Corruption and tomb robbery became increasingly visible. Royal succession was unstable, and Ramesses III himself died after a palace conspiracy in which members of his household were implicated. His successors continued using the name Ramesses, but the name could not restore the conditions that had made Ramesside authority powerful. By the end of the New Kingdom, the high priests of Amun exercised enormous influence in the south, while rulers in the delta controlled the north. Egypt had again divided. Over the following centuries, Libyan dynasties, Nubian kings from Kush, Assyrians, local Egyptian rulers, and Persians competed for control. This period is sometimes described simply as decline, but Egypt remained wealthy and strategically valuable. Its temples functioned, its culture continued, and some foreign rulers adopted Egyptian titles and religious traditions because governing Egypt required participation in its political language. Egypt could absorb outsiders culturally, even when it could not exclude them militarily. That resilience explains why the final fall took so long. Conquerors did not erase Egypt each time they entered it. They frequently presented themselves as pharaohs, supported temples, used Egyptian administration, and placed their authority inside traditions far older than their own regimes. When Alexander the Great took Egypt from the Persian Empire in 332 BC, he was received as a liberator by at least part of the population and was recognized through pharaonic forms of rule. After his death, one of his generals, Ptolemy, established a dynasty that governed Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. The Ptolemies were Macedonian Greek rulers, but they did not simply replace Egyptian kingship. They combined Greek royal culture with Egyptian religious legitimacy. They founded and expanded Alexandria as a Mediterranean capital, developed a sophisticated tax system, supported temples, and exploited Egypt's agricultural wealth. Greek became central to administration, while Egyptian traditions remained essential outside the ruling elite and within the temples. This hybrid system generated enormous revenue, but it also produced tension. The Ptolemaic monarchy demanded heavy taxation, relied on privileged military and administrative groups, and became increasingly consumed by dynastic conflict. Court rivalries repeatedly invited foreign intervention. By the 1st century BC, the decisive foreign power was Rome. Egypt supplied grain, money, and strategic access to the Eastern Mediterranean. Its rulers could no longer treat Roman politics as something happening beyond their borders. Their survival increasingly depended on alliances with Roman leaders. Cleopatra VII understood this reality better than the romantic legend often allows. She was not merely a queen trapped in a love story. She was defending a wealthy but vulnerable kingdom inside a Roman struggle for supremacy. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony were personal, political, and strategic. They helped preserve her throne, but they also tied Egypt's future to the outcome of Roman civil wars. When Octavian defeated Antony and Cleopatra at Actium in 31 BC, the result was larger than the fall of two rulers. Their deaths the following year ended the Ptolemaic dynasty. Egypt became a Roman province, controlled directly by the victor who would become Augustus. Ancient Egyptian culture did not disappear in 30 BC. Temples continued operating, priests maintained rituals. Egyptian gods spread through the Roman world. Hieroglyphic inscriptions were still produced centuries later. The population continued speaking forms of the Egyptian language that eventually developed into Coptic. What ended was Egypt's existence as an independent kingdom, ruled by its own pharaonic state. The civilization had survived weak floods, civil wars, foreign dynasties, religious revolution, imperial contraction, and repeated political fragmentation. But each recovery had depended on rebuilding centralized command over the Nile's agricultural wealth. By the age of Rome, the resources that once allowed Egypt to dominate its neighbors made it too valuable for the Mediterranean's strongest empire to leave independent. Egypt's monuments create the illusion that its strength came from refusing to change. In reality, it survived because it changed repeatedly. It moved from pyramid-building kingdom to bureaucratic restoration, from defensive state to military empire, from divided territory to foreign-ruled monarchy, and from pharaonic tradition to a Greek-Egyptian political system. But adaptation had a limit. Egyptian kingship could absorb foreign rulers, new gods, new capitals, and new administrative languages. It could not preserve sovereignty once control of the Nile became part of a larger imperial system centered elsewhere. The pyramids were built to defeat time. The state behind them could not.